Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a fascinating topic today, one that's really got people talking. Can we actually boost European innovation just by changing competition policies?
Hmm, interesting question.
It is. And we're going to unpack it all using this report from the Center for European Reform by Zach Myers. He's a real expert in this area.
Yeah, I've read some of his work. Really insightful.
Right. And you know what? He makes some points that might surprise you, especially if you're used to how the U.S. approaches innovation. But before we get into all those juicy details, let's set the scene a little.
Yeah, good idea.
We're talking about Europe's struggle to keep up with the U.S. and China, especially when it comes to productivity and developing those groundbreaking technologies. And, this isn't just some theoretical debate, right?
Right.
It has real-world consequences for Europe's economy and its place on the global stage.
Absolutely. And this is where you come in, dear listener.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Think about your own connection to Europe. Maybe you're involved in a European business or passionate about the European tech scene, or maybe you're just fascinated by how global economic forces are shifting and how that affect you.
Definitely. Whatever your connection is, this deep dive should give you some food for thought.
I think so.
So we've got this kind of sluggish innovation in Europe, right?
Yeah.
And some pretty influential people like former Italian prime ministers Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, even British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, are suggesting that we need to change things up. They think that revamping Europe's competition policies could be the key to jumpstarting innovation.
It's a pretty significant push for change, and it's coming from the top.
It is. But then Myers comes along with this report and throws a bit of a wrench in the works.
Oh.
He argues that competition policy isn't the main villain in this story. In fact, he even points out that Europe already has tougher competition policies than the U.S. And you know what that's led to? Lower prices for consumers.
Interesting. But has that translated into more innovation?
That's the thing, not necessarily.
It's not always a simple equation, is it?
It's not. And this is
Yeah.
where things get a bit wonky, so bear with me. Myers says there's this U-shaped relationship between competition and innovation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for us.
All right, so imagine you have one company that's totally dominant.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
There's no incentive for them to innovate because, well, they're already on top. They're not really feeling the pressure.
Makes sense.
But then on the flip side, if you have a ton of tiny companies all competing on price, they might not have the resources to invest in that groundbreaking research and development.
Right, they're too busy just trying to stay afloat.
Exactly. So it's not about having as much competition as humanly possible. It's about finding that sweet spot,
Balance.
yeah, where there's enough competition to drive progress without stifling it.
And Myers argues that Europe might be leaning a bit too far towards that stifling side.
Interesting. So if just changing competition policies isn't enough, what are the things that are really holding European innovation back?
Well, Myers points to a few key culprits. One is this kind of stagnant business environment that's dominated by older companies, and they're more focused on those incremental improvements rather than like groundbreaking innovations.
So they're playing it safe instead of swinging for the fences.
That's one way to put it. And it's a pretty stark contrast to the U.S., where there's a much bigger appetite for risk-taking and long-term investment. And that lets companies embrace those radical shifts that often drive major innovations.
That's a good point. It makes me wonder if this aversion to risk in Europe could be tied to the way the European market itself is structured. I mean, Europe's not one big country, right?
Yeah.
It's a bunch of different countries, each with their own rules and ways of doing business. Does that make it harder for European companies to grow as quickly as we see in the U.S.?
That's a sharp observation. And you're spot on. Myers argues that this fragmented nature of the European market is another major obstacle to innovation. Think about it. American firms can scale up fast across a massive single market. But European companies, they run into all these regulatory hurdles, these barriers between different countries.
It's like they're running a race with obstacles in their lane.
Exactly. It makes it much harder for them to reach the same level of growth and reach as their American counterparts.
So we've got this risk-averse business culture and a fragmented market, both working against innovation. Anything else Myers calls out?
He also takes aim at this idea that focusing on telecoms for innovation is the way to go.
Really?
Yeah, and it might seem counterintuitive at first. There are valid concerns about underinvestment in European telecoms, but Myers points out that this sector is already quite mature. It's unlikely to see that kind of disruptive innovation that would fundamentally change things.
So he's basically saying, look, European telecoms are generally pretty reliable and affordable compared to other places.
Exactly.
Is constant innovation always the answer, or are there other things to consider, like stability and accessibility?
Right. It challenges the idea that more innovation automatically equals a better outcome. Sometimes steady progress and affordability are just as important, especially for essential services like telecoms.
It's about finding the right balance. And that balance might be different depending on what sector we're talking about. What works for the U.S. tech sector might not be the right approach for European telecoms.
Precisely. And speaking of the tech sector, that brings us to another interesting piece of this puzzle, the Digital Markets Act, or DMA.
Ah, the DMA. Things are about to get interesting.
They are. It represents a different approach, one that's trying to regulate how those big tech giants like Google and Meta behave. The idea is to create a more level playing field for smaller companies and hopefully encourage more innovation.
So like making sure the big guys don't squash all the little guys trying to grow.
That's a good way to put it. It's about creating a more dynamic and innovative digital ecosystem.
Okay, so let's unpack the DMA a little. What's it trying to do, and how could it affect innovation in Europe?
At its heart, the DMA is about preventing those big tech companies, they call them gatekeepers, from abusing their power.
Okay.
It's about ensuring fair competition and giving smaller players a fighting chance.
Makes sense. But isn't there a risk that too much regulation could actually stifle innovation? I mean, you could argue that those tech giants got so big because they were able to operate with fewer rules, right?
That's a valid concern, and it is a tricky balancing act. The DMA has to find that sweet spot between promoting competition and giving companies enough freedom to innovate and experiment.
So how does that actually work in practice? What kind of rules does the DMA have?
Well, for example, it stops those gatekeepers from unfairly promoting their own products over their rivals' products. It also makes it easier for users to switch between different platforms and services.
So no more making it a huge pain to move your data from one platform to another.
Exactly. It's about giving users more control and increasing competition between those platforms. Okay, I get it. But how do we know if it's actually working? It seems like it's still pretty early days for the DMA.
It is early, yeah. It's going to take time to see the full effects. But it's a big step, and it'll be really interesting to see how it shapes the digital landscape in Europe.
So we've got a lot going on here. Tough competition policies, a business environment that's not exactly bursting with risk takers, a fragmented market, and then these digital giants. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But understanding these different pieces is key to figuring out how Europe can really boost innovation and secure its economic future. It really is. And, the DMA is a great example of that complexity. You mentioned data portability, right?
Yeah.
That's a key part of the DMA. Basically, it means you have the right to easily move your data from one platform to another. Think of it like moving your stuff from one apartment to a new one.
You shouldn't have to leave everything behind.
Exactly.
Okay.
The DMA also tackles this thing called interoperability, which basically means different platforms should be able to work together smoothly.
Okay, I'm following. Imagine being able to easily send messages between different social media apps or using any music streaming service with your smart speaker. That's the kind of interconnected world the DMA is aiming for.
It sounds like it could really shake things up in the tech world.
Yeah.
But how does all of this connect back to encouraging innovation?
Well, by kind of breaking down these walled gardens that the big tech companies have built, the DMA hopes to open up more opportunities for smaller companies and startups. They'll have a better chance to compete if users can easily switch platforms and access their data.
So it's about leveling the playing field so that innovation can come from anywhere, not just within those big tech companies.
Exactly. And remember Myers' argument that sometimes stability and affordability are just as important as, constant disruption.
Yeah.
The DMA is trying to strike a balance between encouraging competition and making sure that those essential digital services stay reliable and affordable.
It's definitely a balancing act. And it makes me think about how we often talk about innovation as if it's always a good thing, like it always leads to better outcomes. But as we've been discussing, it's not always that simple.
You're right. Myers' report really challenges that assumption. It highlights the trade-offs that come with all this disruption.
Because there can be downsides.
Yeah, especially if it comes at the cost of things like Affordability or stability?
I think a good example of that is the whole debate around 5G technology.
Mm.
There's so much hype about its potential, but it's also raised concerns about cost and who actually has access to it.
Hmm.
Some people say we need to make sure everyone has access to affordable and reliable internet before we jump ahead to the next big thing.
That's a valid point. It speaks to the need for a more nuanced approach to innovation, one that considers the broader impact on society and not just the technological progress.
So if we step back and look at the big picture, it seems like Myers is saying that Europe needs to go beyond just tweaking competition policy if it really wants to become a leader in innovation.
Yeah.
He's calling for a more, comprehensive strategy, one that addresses those deeper issues we talked about earlier, like the risk-averse business culture and the fragmented market.
Yes, exactly. And he even suggests that maybe, just maybe, Europe could learn something from how the U.S. approaches risk and long-term investment.
Interesting.
You know, we often think of the European and American approaches as being totally different, but maybe there's a way to find some middle ground to combine the best of both worlds.
I mean, think about it. The U.S. has an amazing track record when it comes to innovation, especially in tech. But it's also got its problems, right? Like huge wealth inequality and a lack of safety nets.
Right.
Could Europe adopt some of the good parts of the U.S. model without falling into those same traps?
That's a great question, and one we'll keep exploring.
For sure. So let's dig a little deeper into those structural issues that Myers sees as real barriers for Europe. We've talked about the risk-averse business culture. But what about the fragmented market? How does that actually affect a company's ability to innovate and grow?
Okay, imagine you're a European startup with a fantastic new product. You've tested it in your home market, and it's a hit. Now you want to expand to other European countries, but then you realize,
It's not that easy.
yeah, each country has its own set of rules, its own consumer preferences, even its own payment systems.
It's like starting over every time you cross a border.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly time-consuming and expensive. It can stifle growth and make companies less likely to take risks on new ideas.
So meanwhile, your American counterpart is just scaling up smoothly across a huge market, reaching tons of new customers easily.
Exactly. It's not just the regulations themselves, it's the added complexity and burden they put on businesses.
It makes it harder to innovate, especially for smaller companies that might not have the resources to deal with this whole regulatory maze.
Exactly. And this fragmentation also affects investment. Venture capitalists and investors, they want to back companies that can grow quickly and reach a big market. But if a European company is held back by all these hurdles in that fragmented market, it becomes a less appealing investment.
So it's like they're swimming upstream while their American counterparts have a clear path forward.
That's a good way to put it. And it highlights the need for a more unified approach within Europe, one that reduces barriers to trade and makes it easier for companies to work across borders.
And that brings us to the heart of Myers' argument, right?
Yes.
He believes that fixing this market fragmentation is crucial for unlocking Europe's potential for innovation. And he sees the European single market as a powerful tool for doing that.
Absolutely. The single market has already brought huge benefits to Europe in terms of trade and economic integration. But there's still more work to be done to fully realize its potential for innovation.
So what are some concrete things that could be done to strengthen the single market and make it more innovation-friendly?
One key area is regulatory harmonization. It doesn't mean creating identical rules for every single country, but it does mean streamlining regulations and getting rid of unnecessary differences that create those barriers for businesses.
It's about finding common ground and creating a more level playing field.
Exactly. Another important thing is promoting collaboration and knowledge sharing across borders.
Okay.
This could involve things like connecting startups and researchers from different countries, helping them form partnerships, and making it easier to exchange ideas.
It's about breaking down those silos and building a more interconnected European innovation ecosystem.
Precisely. And of course, investing in infrastructure is crucial. This includes not just physical stuff like roads and bridges, but also digital infrastructure like high-speed internet and data centers.
It's about creating the foundation for a truly digital and interconnected Europe where innovation can thrive.
Absolutely. And one more thing that Myers stresses is the importance of fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and risk-taking.
I like that.
This goes beyond just policy changes. It requires a shift in mindset.
It's about encouraging people to see failure as an opportunity to learn and to view entrepreneurship as a real career path.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where people feel empowered to take risks and chase their ideas.
So it's a multifaceted challenge, that requires a holistic approach. We need to address the regulations, encourage collaboration, invest in infrastructure, and cultivate a culture of entrepreneurship. It's not a quick fix, but it's essential for unleashing Europe's full innovation potential.
I couldn't agree more. It's a long-term project, but it's definitely worth it.
Now, let's go back to that idea of risk aversion we talked about before. Meyer says Europe needs to embrace a bit more of that Silicon Valley mentality, where failure is seen as a stepping stone to success. How can we change this mindset and encourage more risk-taking in the European business world?
That's a great question, and I think it starts with changing how we talk about failure. In Europe, failure is often seen as a bad thing, something to be ashamed of.
Like it holds people back from even trying.
Exactly. We need to reframe failure as a valuable learning experience, as a necessary part of the innovation process. In Silicon Valley, failure is often celebrated, like a badge of honor.
Showing you pushed boundaries and learned something along the way.
Exactly. And I think another important thing is to change the incentives in the system. Right now, there are often more rewards for playing it safe and sticking with what's familiar. We need to create incentives that reward innovation and risk-taking, even if that means accepting the possibility of failure.
So we need to shift from a culture that punishes failure to one that rewards experimentation and learning.
Exactly. And this requires everyone to work together: policymakers, investors, entrepreneurs, educators. We need to create an environment where taking risks is seen as valuable, as a necessary part of building a successful business.
So it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing mindsets and building a culture that supports innovation. It's a big task, but I think it's vital if Europe wants to compete globally.
I completely agree. It's a long-term project, but one worth pursuing.
Now, I want to touch on something else that Myers brings up: the importance of investing in research and development over the long term. He argues that Europe needs to be willing to play the long game when it comes to innovation.
He's absolutely right. He talks about how the U.S. has been successful partly because it's been willing to put a lot of money into basic research, often without expecting an immediate return. This has led to breakthroughs in fields like biotechnology and artificial intelligence that have had a huge impact globally.
It's about recognizing that innovation is a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And it takes patience and a willingness to invest for the long haul, even if the payoff isn't immediate.
Oh, that can be tough, right?
It can.
Especially in a world where everyone wants quick results. How can Europe encourage more long-term investment in innovation?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing the value of basic research and creating policies that support it. This could mean increasing funding for research institutions, giving tax breaks to companies that invest in R&D, and creating a more stable and predictable funding environment.
It's about sending a clear signal that Europe is serious about innovation in the long term.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to encourage collaboration between universities, industries, and the government.
To break down those silos.
Yeah, and make sure that research is actually being turned into real-world solutions.
It's about creating this positive cycle where research leads to innovation, which leads to economic growth, which then leads to more investment in research.
Exactly. It's a long-term strategy, but it's worked well in other parts of the world.
So as we wrap up this part of the discussion on the obstacles to European innovation, it's clear that there's no easy answer. It needs a multi-pronged approach that tackles the regulations, the risk aversion, and the lack of long-term investment.
I completely agree. And it needs everyone to work together: policymakers, businesses, and individuals.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to go back to that key question we posed at the start of this deep dive. Can changing Europe's competition policies really spark innovation? Or are there deeper issues at play? Based on what we've discussed today, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's obvious that competition policy is important.
Yeah.
But as Meyer's report shows, it's not the only factor. Focusing solely on competition policy without addressing those deeper structural issues is unlikely to lead to major breakthroughs.
It's like trying to solve a complex problem with only one tool.
Exactly. We need to look at the whole ecosystem: the regulations, the business culture, the investment landscape, and even the societal values that shape innovation.
So it's a nuanced issue, and it needs a holistic approach.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive has done a great job of exploring those nuances and giving us a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing European innovation.
I agree. And I think it's important to remember these complexities as we think about potential solutions. We need to avoid simple answers and embrace the messy reality of innovation.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, as you move on to our final thoughts, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay, I'm listening.
We talked about how the DMA is trying to regulate the big tech companies and create a more competitive digital landscape. But what about those sectors where innovation might not be the main goal? Like healthcare or education? What does innovation even look like in those areas? Is it always about disruption and new technology, or are there other things to consider?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's worth exploring further. How do we balance the desire for innovation with other important values, like fairness, accessibility, and sustainability?
It's a complex challenge, and I think it requires a careful and nuanced approach.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that I hope our listeners will continue to engage with.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how we define innovation, doesn't it?
It does. We tend to focus on those flashy gadgets and new technologies, but innovation can also be about finding better ways to provide services, reaching more people, or making systems more efficient and fair.
Right. It's not always about the next big thing.
Exactly. Take healthcare, for instance. Innovation in healthcare might not always involve some revolutionary new drug. It could be about simplifying those administrative processes, using telemedicine to reach people in remote areas, or even developing personalized treatments based on someone's genes.
It's about tailoring solutions to the specific needs and challenges of each sector.
Exactly. And those solutions might look completely different from what we see in the tech industry.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. We've covered some pretty complex ideas today. The limits of competition policy, the hurdles of a fragmented market, the rise of those digital giants, and the need for a more nuanced understanding of innovation across different sectors.
We've definitely challenged some common assumptions along the way, like the idea that more competition always leads to better results, or that innovation is always about disruption and new technology.
We've explored a lot, but this is really just the start of a bigger conversation. And I hope this deep dive has given you some fresh insights to think about.
Maybe it's raised some new questions for you, or maybe you're seeing the European innovation landscape in a whole new light.
Whatever your takeaway, we encourage you to keep digging into this topic. Read Meyer's full report, check out other perspectives, and most importantly, keep asking questions.
Because at the end of the day, the future of European innovation depends on these kinds of discussions, on challenging assumptions, and on finding solutions that work for everyone.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Until next time.